Alrighty, we are at 1:01 Eastern, so let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining our 9th bootcamp session of the Run on Less Electric Depot series. My name is Rachel Ellenberger. I'm the Industry Engagement Manager for the North American Council for Freight Efficiency. Next slide, please. As this is our 9th session, this is our second to last session of the Run on Less Electric Depot series. NACFE and RMI have hosted this series throughout the summer, discussing all things fleet depot electrification. This slide shows our full schedule of bootcamp sessions, which is still available online at runonless.com. Next slide, please. Our next and final session will take place on September 5th. Our moderator, John Richardson, will host his panel of experts to discuss our final topic of the series, electric depot site planning and construction. Next slide, please. If we could go to the next slide, please. Perfect. So I'd now like to turn it over to our Director of Communications, Denise Rondini, who will cover updates from the run with us today. Denise.
Thanks, Rachel. So as of today, we've published 7 of the 10 fleet profiles. The Frito-Lay profile of their location in Queens just published a couple hours ago. So that leaves us 3 more profiles. One will publish Thursday, one will publish Tuesday, and the final one on Thursday of next week. Run on Less kicks off on September 11th, as you know. During the 3 weeks of the run, we're going to be publishing stories from the run, which will talk about various aspects of the electrification process. On September 11th, on September 18th, we're going to issue some mid-run results. And then on October 5th, we're going to issue a report of our initial findings, or probably a press release from the run. And then throughout 2024, we'll be issuing reports from what we learned. And that takes care of it, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And as always, I have a quick few bits of housekeeping before we get started. If we could go to the next slide. I would like to thank the session sponsor, Pepsi. Pepsi is our one and only executive sponsor for the Run on Less Electric Depot series. So thank you so much to PepsiCo for our ongoing partnership. Next slide, please. As a reminder, the quiz will be available online immediately following today's session. This is going to be your opportunity to test your knowledge from the session. Upon completion of the session's quiz, you will receive your Depot Proficient badge, and after completing all 10 session quizzes, which will be available after our September 5th session, you will receive your Expert badge. So to access the quiz, all you'll need to do is go to the landing page for this session on runonless.com. After the session wraps up, you'll see the button to take the quiz. And a reminder that the materials and quizzes from our last sessions are still available online. So if you didn't get to take the chance, or if you didn't get the chance to take the quiz after the last few sessions, the quizzes, the session recordings, the materials, the slides, and all additional resources are available online still. Next slide, please. As a reminder, the session is being recorded. Like I mentioned, it will be available online later this week. If you didn't get a chance to submit a question on the registration form and you would like to do so, please use the Q&A controls in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. During the session, I will be elevating the questions to our speakers. And for those that we don't get to cover during this session, we are still collecting them to build out future content. So if there's something that you're curious about, be sure to send it in. And finally, if you run into any technical issues, please reach out to Stefan Babcock at GNA, who will help you troubleshoot. Next slide, please. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our moderator, Ari Khan, who you'll remember from sessions 1 and 6. Ari is the carbon-free transportation manager for RMI and will be leading the session today.
Rachel, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining us. I'm very excited about this panel. The topic here is scaling electric truck infrastructure or charging infrastructure. And to me, the key question there is what's the best way for a fleet that is interested and perhaps tested a few electric trucks to scale all the way up to a complete or nearly complete electric truck fleet. So, and we have a great panel with us today. Next slide, please. I struggled with a visual for how to show a fleet going from just one or two electric trucks to many, but you can imagine if your electric truck is Waldo, this may be what your depot looks like today. And next slide, please. And this is ultimately where you want to be. So next slide, please. To put some structure on the question of how to scale a site and infrastructure, I thought that the panel would work around one hypothetical case. But obviously, everybody's situation is different, and feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. We're going to leave the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. But the scenario that this panel is looking at, or that we're going to talk around, is imagine a facility that's got 80 trucks in it. The goal is to fully electrify by 2030. That depot has 2 trucks and 2 temporary chargers now, and it anticipates it's going to need about 50 kW for each electrified truck when it completely electrifies. So how do you get that 4 megawatt facility done in the sort of in the way that creates the least risk, the least exposure, and the lowest cost for the fleet operator? It's a tough question, so I'm glad we have our panel here to talk about it with us. In no particular order, I wanted to first introduce Devin. Devin is ABB's e-mobility business development manager for fleet and transit solutions. She has a long history in energy, including working on pipeline fuel purchases and fleet engagement there, so she understands non-electric fleets. And then, like me, she has utility EV experience and works and is now at ABB helping fleets electrify their vehicles. Paul is an associate vice president of global transportation initiatives at Black & Veatch. He's been doing that. He can tell you how long he's been doing that for, but it's been for at least the 10 years I've known him. He understands vehicles and electricity very well and is endlessly curious and energized, which means that he works on everything: cars, trucks, planes, and marine fleets. And he's generous about sharing his insights and making sure the whole industry builds knowledge and expertise. Danny Marquez is an energy solutions director for Exos. Danny's a reformed engineer, having worked on power projects in Chad. He also oversaw EV charging infrastructure at Amazon before joining Exos Energy Solutions, or XES. XES helps customers from scoping their charging needs all the way to construction and management. And finally, last but not least, is Rob Wozni. Rob's a product manager at Shell Recharge Renewables and Energy Solutions, and he creates customized behind-the-meter charging solutions for fleets. And like me and Devin, he has experience on the other side of the meter, managing utility vehicle electrification projects. And like Paul, he's generous with his expertise, having served on the Clean Cities Board of Directors and as an advisor to EPRI on road transportation and electrification projects. So without further ado, I'm hoping to sort of start the questions with our panel, discussing again what it takes to electrify this hypothetical 80 truck depot that will have ultimately 4 megawatts of power needs. So a question for the panel, and I think we'll start in that order that I introduced folks. So Devin first. What does a facility have to know? So the facility has about 4 trucks that it's feeding now with temporary chargers, and as this goal of fully electrified by 2030. What does a facility need to know about its trucks to make a complete e-truck transition? That's the first question.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of the information that you need to know about your trucks are things that fleet owners and fleet managers are already super familiar with. They know where those vehicles go every day. They know the most amount of mileage those vehicles are going to go every day. Because we do want to plan for the furthest the vehicle will go so you don't get in a bad situation. They also are usually quite familiar with, obviously, the driver shifts, what their site layout looks like, how traffic moves through that site, how they're fueling currently and how that can be adapted to electrification, like if they are just an out and back truck, if they're an over the road truck. They understand the different roles that their dispatchers play in relationship to those trucks. Are they kind of figuring everything out for the driver, like where they're going to fuel next, or do the drivers have a little more autonomy as to how they manage that on the gas diesel side, and then also how to mitigate that on the electric side. And then finally, when considering which electric trucks to replace those gas diesel trucks with, they have to consider things like where the port is located, where in this parking situation these chargers are going to be, that both fits. You can reach the truck to plug it in, which is kind of important, but it also doesn't disrupt traffic too much so that you have to teach your guys a whole new traffic pattern, because you have to remember you're also compounding if you've got multiple shifts, when the guys are coming in where they're parking their personal cars, when they're coming in to charge at the end of their shift, just to kind of keep traffic moving and optimize that space the best.
Great. Thank you, Devin. Paul, I think you were next.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a couple clues for the quiz at the end, so be listening here. So starting with something pretty straightforward. This is a transportation business. This organization makes their money and their sustainable financial existence on moving vehicles. So you do need to learn a bit more about electric. You also you need to understand a few key terms that I'm going to throw out here. You're going to need to understand kilowatts, which you've expressed here for charger, which is the instant demand, how many watts per hour, and also, oh, I did it all wrong, the power level that you're drawing at, and then we need to know kilowatt hours. Kilowatt hours equating to the total amount of fuel. And as Devin mentioned, fleet managers, they do tend to know this based today on their liquid fuels or perhaps CNG and what they're doing. So getting a viewpoint of that and thinking about it in a holistic way about their operations. How does it fit in? Do they need to charge them all simultaneously? Do they have enough time to be able to do that maybe throughout the day? The return to service question versus fueling conveniently overnight is going to be something to be looked at. And that was my dog, if the dog came through. Nothing like a webinar. So I think those are a few things that they want to really think about, and also those pivot points on their journey, like one charger, two charger, potato chips, maybe even Pepsi might say with Frito. If you like them and you start to adopt more of them, you need to think about that timeline and not re-spending, perhaps on even just the soft costs to get your plans to go.
Rob and Danny, I'm hoping you can add to sort of Devin and Paul's answer, but also help understand another question, which is does a fleet need to sort of scale up linearly, right? Add 10 chargers at a time, 10 chargers 1 year, 10 chargers the next, et cetera, to keep learning? Or can they do enough of the analysis that Devin and Paul recommended just with, let's say, 2 trucks and chargers to be able to be confident about going big? So feel free to answer the first question, which is, what do they need to know? But if you could also sort of add some detail about whether or not they can know enough by studying with 2 trucks, or if they have to scale gradually, that would be great. Danny?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to what Devin and Paul said, which is knowing the operations and then kind of working backwards from that. So an additional thing to build on what Devin was saying is those routes that the trucks are going, you're going to want to know what the most predictable, or one way to do it is, what is the most predictable and shortest routes? And then from there, you can calculate what battery capacity you're going to need on the vehicle. And once you have the battery capacity, then you think about the dwell time. So jargon, but how long is a vehicle stationary, or how long does it have to charge? From those 2 variables, and there's still quite a few others that we can add there and caveats, but at a bare minimum, from those 2 variables, you can then start thinking about what size of chargers you're going to install at the facility. And then to your second question, if you have a site, if this is the first site where you've only deployed 2 vehicles and a few chargers, you're probably going to want to scale up just a little bit more to really understand how EVs are going to plug into your operations before really hitting the gas on the electrification goals. Some of the reasons for that are, once you install the chargers and get them in the ground and start charging your vehicles, that's a pretty complex process. There's permitting, there's construction, there's commissioning, there's understanding kilowatts and kilowatt hours, as Paul stated. But then after that, your chargers are also going to become part of your fleet. So they're going to come with downtime, they're going to have issues. You're going to have to call service technicians unless you're doing that internally. So all of that takes a bit to kind of integrate into your operations. And so I think it's important, if it's a first site that you're electrifying, to scale up to, you know, maybe another 5, 10, 15% of your fleet. Test that out, see how that's operating and impacting your operations. And then from there, I think you're pretty confident in knowing what the 100% electrification journey is going to look like, and then accelerate from there.
Thanks, Danny. Oh, Rob, you're on mute.
Thought I took it off. Sorry, everyone. So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this, since the panel has addressed the vehicle side very well. On the infrastructure and the rest of it, understanding your existing use of energy, understanding the size of the fleet, the existing service from your provider, and where you ultimately may go is incredibly important before you put anything in the ground. And, you know, installing a few trucks or chargers to support trucks to test the waters, you're always going to want to try to keep things at a specific site or a couple of sites, rather than start to replace vehicles during their normal duty cycle replacements at multiple facilities by chasing those vehicles with chargers. It can add up and get quite costly to do it that way. And a better practice is to get an understanding of where you may be going in the long run, and what you want to do to evaluate and get started. And if you can do that in blocks, your block may be different than the next company's block, to understand what you ultimately are going to want to install. By installing it in a block pattern, you can bring down the costs, you can scale pretty easily, and then it gives you more opportunity to evaluate what else is out there as technology changes and things develop. But I think knowing all of the other items would help. We have a term that everybody uses called stranded assets, and adding a few chargers to support a few vehicles working off existing service is relatively easy today. But what happens when you go to scale that infrastructure, it ends up in many cases requiring you to rip and replace and redistribute the infrastructure you've already put in. So having a full understanding can help in the case of large scale deployments.
Robin, Danny, you both sort of talked about, you know, what sort of the minimal amount of infrastructure you need to put in and how to put it in so that you don't, you know, so it's not stranded later. So I guess my question would be, what are the assets that, let's say you're going, we use Danny's ratio here, and you get 10 to 15% of your fleet. So in this case, let's say 15, you know, let's say 10 trucks. Let's say you've electrified 10 trucks and put in the requisite charging. and then you want to go to 100%. What is likely to be sort of stranded or wasted from your first deployment? And is there anything you can do to kind of mitigate some of that loss? And anybody should feel free to jump in.
I think a lot of it comes down to kind of knowing what your endpoint is, and like what your goal is, whether it's an internal carbon neutral goal or just a goal for your fleet. Say, you know, I want to electrify 80% by 2030, and this is what that's going to look like. These are the vehicles I want to electrify. You know, maybe we'll leave a couple of these more heavy duty ones out that have weird duty cycles because we're not quite there yet with technology, but this is what I want to get done. This is how I want it to look. That does not mean that your project absolutely has to look like that or game over, but having that forethought really helps with scaling this infrastructure. So you're not just buying chargers just to say, oh, I checked the box, I have an electric truck. Oh, I checked another box, I have 10 electric trucks. And then, you know, as technology moves forward, your smaller chargers maybe aren't what you need, or you order a charger that's just too big, or you don't necessarily, it's hard to get the power to it. You didn't really converse with the utility first, and you just have this very expensive piece of equipment sitting in your yard and it's not really getting used. So I think that really kind of knowing your plan and taking an intelligent approach to it, whether you do it quickly or slowly, just kind of knowing what the endpoint looks like and what you need to achieve to get there, and making sure that each piece of equipment you purchase serves a function and can serve a function when you have that final product in 2030 or whatever the year may be.
Or I'll take a shot at it. In some frame, you need to look at the asset classes, right? So a distribution grid being built out to a site could be a 20, 50-year asset to the utility. Your on-site switchgear and transformers could easily become 20-year type assets. And then the cabling and the trenches, the things that you bury in the ground, those are expensive to dig them back up. So you want to do those also on a long-term view. The chargers and the endpoints might perhaps be something that'll be swapped or moved or migrated. So we are seeing that needs to be kind of part of your considerations. We are also seeing, although it can be more expensive to have mobile assets built in a way that can be brought on site and taken somewhere else, that can actually advance the calendars for sites. And it does start to get into grid gaps and what we will do to print those electrons out there at the edge of the grid. But there are definitely solutions, and they're not super inexpensive to put a bunch of batteries there, for example, or looking for low or no carbon generation out at the edge of the grid. But they might be temporary, which allow you to get your goals and then be more thoughtful. And as you look at 2030, that's not far away, by the way, and it could be 4 to 5 years for the grid to get there. So you've certainly got some time to fill in before then.
I'll jump in again. I think energy, delivery, how are you going to get supply on site, and what are you actually asking for when you're in conversations with your utility? You could be asking for a smaller amount than what you actually need, and then you would have to go back again. So understanding that roadmap and being able to communicate with the utility, understanding the cost to upgrade systems. And I mean, all of us have worked on projects where, you may require to have a substation rebuilt or changes made to be able to supply the necessary amount of power we're talking about. And so if you can understand what you're ultimately going to need and whether the facility and the utility can support it and at what cost, or whether you're going to start to generate energy on site and add battery storage and other things to be able to make better use of the energy, those are all things you need to take into consideration to avoid those stranded assets. The last thing you want to do is make a bunch of changes and upgrades only to find out that you didn't think about the entire fleet and you just aren't going to be able to support it at a facility that you've already sunk quite a bit of expense into.
And I'll add just a couple of more thoughts. I think one of the important things in this case study or in this scenario would be to definitely let the utility know ahead of time that you're planning on going electric with as much time as possible. They'd be very grateful for it. They'd be able to plan better. It's still probably going to be a while before you get all of the power needed for these chargers. But then at least you can work backwards from that and start thinking how you phase in the chargers. Ideally, you set up the site from a trenching and cabling perspective, and just have a stub up for the charger to plug in once you get that power from the beginning. And to give an example of stranded assets, there was a site and a customer who had planned a bit ahead and had installed a lot of the cabling and charging infrastructure needed to install chargers at the site. A couple of years passed before they actually started installing the equipment. And by the time they got there, they'd actually changed their perspective on the type of charger that they wanted to install. And the cabling that had been installed at the site was not compatible. So it required quite a big investment, again, to go in, retrench, remove the cable, replace the cable, and get that site up and running. So, just one small example, in cabling costs or trenching are two of the biggest drivers of total costs for construction. So, having that foresight and thinking about the long term definitely will be a bit of a bigger CapEx investment at the beginning, but long term and overall for a project, it will result in a lower CapEx investment overall.
I bet that site manager wished they had a time machine to just spec slightly larger conduit, Oh well. It sort of seems like there's a general agreement here, and that's okay because we got the excitement from Paul's dog barking earlier. So I think it's okay that we all agreed here. That there's some pieces of your site planning that are very high cost and very long lead time. Rob mentioned the grid. Paul talked about some of the Paul and Danny talked about some of the civil work. So so Devin's point of knowing where you want to go, and then also focusing in particular on those pieces and being really careful about those pieces is really vital. Whereas if you mess up the charger speed, it's not ideal, but that a charger wears out a lot quicker than than a trench would. Somebody asked a question from the chat that I think is apt, so I'll relay it here, which is, how do you manage technology risk, right? What technology do you sort of see changing over the next 10 years that would make some of the site investments you did today potentially obsolete?
I think the prime example I can think of here is as vehicle technology improves and charger technology improves, and I mean, vehicles or battery size on the vehicles, what makes up those batteries to help them have more capacity and have a longer range, and then on the other side, the chargers too. I know every charging company is increasing the power of these chargers. So, I don't want to say hesitation, but one of the things we do have to keep in mind is, like for this example, a 50 kilowatt charger. If we've got 80 trucks, a 50 kilowatt charger, unless it's a 1-to-1 ratio, great, but now we've got a ton of infrastructure in the ground, kind of like we talked about in the previous question. But when we are looking at like 400 kilowatt chargers, 480 and higher chargers, we can get trucks like flying in and out of that place. We have this one piece of infrastructure. And then on the truck side of things, everyone's a little bit hesitant, I think, to kind of buy the first model of a vehicle, whether it's gas, diesel, electric, hydrogen, propane, whatever it happens to be. So as we're starting to get one of the questions that I've had from customers, is kind of, do I do this now? Do I wait for battery range to increase? Kind of where I don't want to buy this truck and then in 3 years they've got one that's got double, triple the range. So I think that those are kind of the two ends of thinking about, just at a basic level, the technology that could change that might affect what your infrastructure. Don't get me wrong, please still electrify, but there's things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I'd say that, like three kind of ways that I think about that or segment that question is, one of them is on the vehicle side and the technology risk associated with that. Another one is on the chargers themselves, and then the third one is on the charging infrastructure, the switchgear, the transformers, the panel boards. That one, I think that technology will continue to improve and get better over time, especially as we're electrifying more and more. But it's been around for a really long time. By and large, it's fairly reliable. It's not going anywhere. It's manufactured by large OEMs, so not a huge risk. On the vehicle side, I think that the vehicles that are on the market now, while they might not be here, in the current iteration in the next 10, 15, 20 years, they're still going to exist and continue to get better. I don't think that it's much of a risk in the sense that battery technology is going to go away. It's more so going to get denser. Costs are going to continue to drop as they have been over the last 5, 10 years. And on the charger front, I think that also by and large has kind of been de-risked. Chargers have been around for a long time. Right now we're scaling them at a rate that hasn't existed in the past, but typically what happens when you scale a technology, and I'll use solar, wind, and even storage as examples, is costs go down over time, reliability goes up over time. So there's a risk that maybe some charger OEMs I think might not be around, but there's going to be charger options that you're going to be able to swap out over time. So I think it is a concern, and it's important to consider, what vehicle types you're going to go with and who you're going to partner up with. Same thing on the charger side, and you select a couple of them to mitigate some of that supply chain risk. But I see it as a technology that's mostly been proven and is only going to continue to get better.
And I'll add to that. I think one of the things that we're already seeing getting better is payment systems, processing, energy management. There are tremendous improvements being made and being worked on that will allow a more seamless interaction with the chargers. And so I think being able to understand the impact as you're moving energy around a facility and how it's impacted by the charging is also something we haven't really touched on, but incredibly valuable to the audience. Because if you're looking to add other technologies as heat pumps get better and we start deploying heat pumps in the north, what impact is that going to have on your energy load at a facility? So you really have to start looking at a lot of these things and how they're interacting one with the other. And I think some of these changes with the way we manage energy could actually reduce the amount of infrastructure we need to put in the ground.
Interesting. So I guess I'm hearing sort of, Rob, that's an interesting wrinkle, which is that you have to look at the whole facility because the facility's load is going to change. But and what I got from Danny and Devin there was that fundamentally the amount of energy each truck is going to use could go up as trucks get better and you're able to use them for sort of some of your harder applications. But for the applications that work for electric trucks now, they're going to use the same amount of kilowatt hours later. But Devin's point was also that you have to look out for some of the fast charging that's coming, that's starting to mature a little bit, because that may ultimately be a cheaper, easier paradigm for you to sort of cycle your trucks through, which we saw Pepsi doing, in the run video with their semis. So, Paul, Paul, do you want to jump in, Paul? You look like you want to.
You throw me a question and I'll fit it in. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. We were talking a little bit. You were talking a little bit earlier about the need to understand kilowatts and kilowatt hours. But when you're talking about a 4 megawatt facility, that's not, you need an advanced amount of energy knowledge, right? Electricity knowledge. That's the power equivalent of a sports stadium or steel mill. So what does a fleet operator have to know? How advanced of an electric customer do they have to be when they're talking about taking in 4 megawatts of power?
So it's, I was saying about spelling, you got to know how to spell kilowatt hours, and you also get it right. You also need to understand and learn about something called medium voltage or primary service. So this is for the folks watching the quiz, is at a certain pivot point, typically around 2.5 megawatts, you're going to want to consider, for several reasons, medium voltage service to your site. That can make it more flexible. That can actually make it easier for the utility to come back and add more power to your existing service without changing your on-site facilities, but rather something can change with regard to the loads they're serving. They could maybe move you to a different feeder, or they augment a feeder, or perhaps even bring power from another angle. So that's something that I'm going to put in there. As you're talking about technology risk, I would talk about capacity risk, right? How do you hedge against a future site running against capacity, and also the real estate to fit this equipment on site, right? So these are serious constraints that you need to think about it. So therefore, it does start to do some math that maybe you want to have 10 1.5 megawatt chargers instead of 100 150s, for example. And that's about an asset class, asset utilization. I'm not saying you're going to solve everything with that particular math, but it certainly takes quite a bit less space. In sites that have, if we're talking about trucking, a ratio of 1 to 3 trailers, you've got to find a place to put your trailers. Not every one of those trailers can just be, an ISO container of batteries necessarily, but you've got to think smartly about how you provision space. You also need to be honest about, you're becoming an industrial load. You need to treat it that way. When you do take primary service, it takes longer to get. There's some bonuses though. You do get lower cost of energy. It could be up to 10%, maybe more. So you need to look at your, what I'm going to say, your power capacity risks, but also your cost of energy, and how does that pencil into all of these things that you're trying to get into your electric future. And sometimes it's difficult for people to imagine power. Go to your local box store, for example, the Costco, even with some of the things they have, that's 1 megawatt typically. Look at that big green box out there in the transformer. We're talking about a site that needs 4 of those. So just kind of get that perspective.
In terms of when you're operating a facility that's 4 megawatts, do you or your staff need to know anything different to be able to be a customer that's consuming that much energy?
Yeah, there are definitely different standards. There are setbacks for that equipment. There's medium voltage switchgear that has different lead times and engineering requirements. Let's just kind of put it, you're not messing around at that point, right? This is what you're going to be doing in an industrial site, a data center. Rob mentioned, perhaps mining, marine, some of these other large loads. So you've got to get experts on board, and you have to also work closely with your utility about what that load trajectory will look like, and the ability to have countermeasures. Sometimes that's going to be tricky. What voltage do you integrate your battery systems? Often today, commercials at 480, so you're going to have to step it down and figure out integrating. The future of technology does offer some solutions to combine transformers, to combine the DC buses so that you can share them in these large boxes with many charging pedestals. So there's a bright future to all of this. Just got to work on the things you can be planning for today.
There's a question from the audience about what the longest lead time item is and how do you mitigate it. I'm suspecting from your and Rob's answers that it's probably the grid connection, but so is that correct, that the grid connection could be the longest item here?
It can be. Grid connection is definitely high on the list, but there are other things that would also push that timeline out. And so it's important to understand what that cost of power is before you ultimately start to pursue a grid connection. There may be some on-site behind the fence energy solutions that may be more economical than just going straight to the grid to provide all the power. So that's something that definitely is going to push the timeline out. And then if you don't mind, I just want to expand on something Paul said a second ago. I think one of the other costs that or impacts of having the high voltage systems on site and that amount of power is peak demand can get out of hand very quickly. And there have been a number of bus deployments in the transit space where we've heard stories about how they were told they were going to be a lot cheaper than running a diesel fleet, only to find they plugged them all in all at the same time and ended up having higher bills than their combustion equipment. So I think you really have to understand energy and its impact across the board.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was talking to a fleet manager who got educated on demand charges after their first electric bill with their trucks, and they became very smart very quick. Devin, we've been talking a lot about kilowatts, kilowatt hours, some of the hard infrastructure that goes into scaling a site. But when we talked earlier, you kind of opened my eyes to the role that stakeholders play. The folks who are either off-site but care about what you're doing on your facility, or your employees. We've seen a little bit of how this works with some of the run videos and how the drivers react to their electric trucks. And the good news, it's been mostly positive. It's been very positive. But I'm curious from you, who the other stakeholders are when you're talking about really scaling a site, really fully electrifying a depot. And how to engage them to make your site electrification either the most economic or the smoothest possible.
I'm so glad you asked, because that is one of my favorite things about the fleet electrification world, because I think it's a little bit underrated in some situations. Is who should I talk to? And my answer is kind of everybody that in some way touches the trucks or touches the truck ecosystem. So as we've said, up one side, down the other, involve your utility early and often. So in this use case, you might not necessarily have to call the utility if you have 2 50 kW chargers, but if you're starting to increase, please talk to the utility, bring them involved in on it. Another thing that you can find out when you talk to them is if they've either got an active or a pending program that will give you money back, which everybody loves. So that's a big one, but you've heard enough about that. But some of the other folks that you really need to get involved in this, your landlord, if you don't own the land, because there are some ways around trenching infrastructure. There are some above ground solutions, some portable solutions. So there are other ways. You don't always necessarily have to dig in to put in infrastructure if your landlord's kind of like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to like you in a couple years and I might not want you running from me. There are some ways around that. Also talking to your customers. Your customers might really be excited by the fact that their packages or whatever it is are going to get delivered by an electric truck. You might get some support that way, some publicity that way. They might kind of post on their social media, LinkedIn, whatever, and in their media posts that you're doing this project. Also if you have dispatchers, talk to your dispatchers. They know the fleet up one side and down the other. They also need to be prepared for any kind of changes they're going to make. I kind of alluded to this before, but when I was in the fuel industry and had this fleet of vehicles delivering fuel, there were only certain locations that they could stop at to fuel. And then other fleet customers I would work with on the fuel card end, their fuel card might be limited as to where they can go fuel. That is going to change a little bit when we get into electrification. These drivers are going to want to know where they can charge if they have to when they're out, if they're not out and back, or if they get stranded somewhere and something happens so they have to charge. They need to know where they're going to charge, and the dispatchers need to know that information, so they're not on like plug share trying to find something. They know exactly where to send their guys, where their trucks are going to fit, and where they have chargers with that power capability. You're also going to want to talk to your drivers, as we also talked about, and prepare them. Talk to the folks in finance. If you're kind of looking at your budget and how to kind of make up for return on investment later on down the road. You're going to have to convince them, hey, I'm going to need X amount more money to run my fleet this year, but in a couple years, you're going to see the total cost start to go down. Also talk to your analytics and reporting folks. There might be some different things that you can do to apply for green credits, and then also some different information that the higher ups are going to want to see both that this program is working, it's going to eventually save them money, and have some little sound bites that they can also publicize. And finally, my absolute favorite people to talk to are the ones who are naysayers, who do not want this project, who don't understand why the company is doing it. A lot of them are not just curmudgeons who don't like change, but sometimes they have very legitimate reasons to not want electrification. One of my favorite anecdotes, a close family friend of mine is a lineman supervisor at Dominion. And when I was at Dominion, we didn't really work together, but we both worked for the company. And when I took the job in electrification, he made fun of me up one side and down the other. Oh, this electric truck thing, it's not going to work out. You can't electrify a bucket truck. It's going to be too heavy. It's going to be terrible. He made fun of me for like the whole 3 years I was there. And then it got worse when I went to ABB. And the other day I was talking to him and he was testing out some electric bucket trucks with one of his crews. And he was like, I kind of owe you an apology. He said, yeah, I think there's still some use cases where it'd be really tough to have an electric bucket truck. He said, but it was so nice to have my crew working and I didn't have to scream at them just to have a conversation. He was like, the truck was so quiet. It was so much safer. And that's the kind of stuff that, when you listen to the naysayers, you're not only going to find maybe something you didn't think of that you want to kind of think outside the box and apply that to electrification. But it's also really fun to have people who were really against it at first kind of come back to you and say, hey, my point was still valid, but I also really appreciate this other thing that electrification really helped with. So that's my spiel on that. But yeah, definitely talk to as many people as you can and don't just dismiss people as being negative Nancy's. Really listen to what they have to say because you might learn something about your fleet that you didn't know.
Thanks, Devin. I think that really lines up with what Danny had said earlier about what you can learn by doing that 10 to 15% electrification, and maybe making that part of a listening tour will really benefit everybody. Rob, I had a question for you. I wanted to know, you were talking a little bit about sort of systems thinking and how to how to sort of consider microgrid options to peak shave off your facility, or switch your facility over to heat pumps to free up electric capacity. So to me, this gets at a question of what are the economies of scale you get from fully electrifying a facility that you don't get when you're just having done 2 or 4 vehicles. So if you have any thoughts on what benefits you unlock by really going all in, becoming this sort of expert energy customer that Paul had said you become as you cross the 2.5 megawatt threshold, what are the benefits in doing that?
Cost is the biggest benefit, and I would just push back a little. I don't think it really matters how big you scale. Understanding how you use energy today, understanding how to integrate the charging with the rest of the load that you have across the facility will better enable you to manage that load throughout the day. And that ultimately is going to end up in saving money on infrastructure build out, saving money on demand charges, and there are a host of other areas that would support that. But I think it's incredibly important. Today it's really easy to go and just look at your existing service, figure out what you can add on to that service, and throw a couple chargers out there. But if you are looking to reduce your carbon footprint and you may want to be adding solar down the road, or you want to bring in other on-site generation, storage, and some of the things that we mentioned earlier, and treating those as a separate asset on your own grid at the facility instead of treating it as a just pure facility load, it gives you more control. And I think we're going to see more of that as we start getting into vehicle to grid capabilities and the ability to engage in demand response programs and be able to get added value out of that infrastructure that's on site. So I think, you know, from a cost perspective, that's going to affect you positively in quite a number of ways.
Interesting. By the way, vehicle to grid was is sort of an example of like a technology perhaps that you know, is going, you know, may change our sort of future charging setups, right? If it's valuable for you to have all your vehicles plugged in, if you're getting really well remunerated from the utility, you know, then you might go with lots of plugs, even though it's more capex upfront. Do other folks? But I digress. To open that question up to everybody else, because I think it's sort of the key one here. What are some economies of scale you get by when you go to sort of fully electrify your fleet? What are some sort of technologies you can, you know, some, as Rob said, some technologies you can deploy at whatever scale, but what are some technologies, you know, you suddenly have access to when you've gone big that you wouldn't have had, you know, at the beginning of your journey?
A couple of thoughts, and I'll add a couple of thoughts on the cost side. You know, once you are deploying hundreds of chargers across sites, some of the cost savings that you'll see is just by negotiating preferential rates with, you know, one or two suppliers if you're going with them. Same thing on the charging infrastructure front, and then same thing when you think about what design firm you're going with or what construction firm you're going with as well. If you can negotiate multi-site agreements or, you know, X amount of chargers deployed over Y amount of time, that definitely impacts the CapEx investment. And then to go to your question, Ari, on the OpEx side, I think some of the really interesting things that you can do is on the electricity front and how you manage your load. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, microgrids. I think somebody mentioned that, maybe Rob. Peak shaving, demand response. When you start getting to the point where your demand charges are, you know, taking up a big chunk of your operating costs for that site or your electricity costs, you definitely want to get smart about what software you're using to manage that load. That ties into what types of chargers that you're using. Are they smart chargers? Do they have load management features? Can you overlay a software on top of those chargers to manage that load? That's definitely something that you're going to want to consider and think about, you know, ideally early on. It's less important if you're just deploying a couple of vehicles to a site. Demand charges might not be that much, but definitely probably when you get above the 10 vehicle per site mark, if they're charging simultaneously, that's definitely when you want to consider some of, you know, either off-grid solutions or ways to reduce your peak demand, or cycle your charges in a certain way to just drop down those costs. The vehicle to grid stuff I think is fascinating and really interesting. TBD on how it plays out, just given how the rules and each OEM kind of has their own specifications on how to use that. But I think that's definitely another one to kind of keep an eye on and see how it evolves.
I think kind of in that vein, sorry, and kind of related to what Danny was saying on the utility side and the infrastructure side, you know, if you have this huge electric fleet program and your utility knows about it, chances are one of those advantages too is you'll kind of be, I don't want to say scapegoat, but or like guinea pig, but you know, if as the utility is maturing and the utility is getting used to fleet electrification and you're one of their big fleets, a lot of these programs they're going to roll out, they're going to want to try with you first. And a lot of those are going to be cost saving. It's going to be managing demand, peak shaving, that sort of thing. So I think that might be kind of a hidden gem of an advantage to having this full fleet program, especially, you know, if you're 5-10 years down the line and you've got this operation that's been running really well. Not only will you be a model for other folks who are trying to do the same thing, but you know, if new technology is coming out, everybody's going to be knocking on your door to try to get it installed, or if it's like on the software side, they're going to want to test it with you first. So I think that that's kind of one of those advantages that seems a little quirky, but could really pay off in the end. You know, to kind of be that come to for different fleet electrification advantages, I guess, or new technologies.
You'll be, as a leader, you get sort of first dibs and VIP access to some.
Yeah, you said that much better than I did. I talked around a little bit, but yeah, exactly.
It's always easier to hold the red pen.
I think there's a lot there to be said about having a portfolio of sites, because first off, you can amortize the soft costs and program management over more sites. That's going to help a project pencil out, and also have additional, runners in the race. If you have only one site and that's the one you're focused on and its interconnection is delayed, then you don't have opportunity to pivot to another site or another state for that matter. I think there's been an awful lot of focus. This is kind of like a California thing and perhaps a New York thing. This is really going to roll across the country quite rapidly. So you need to be thinking about what those portfolios are. There are also business models out there to be aware of. If you're only developing one site because that is your fleet, what choices can you make, whether you do it all yourself and you bear all of those costs to learn and do all of that, or perhaps you find partners that are doing this for multiple fleets at once, and then you get an opportunity to benefit from the buying power that was mentioned earlier. Also, just really that experience. How do you do this?
One question came from I want to sort of add one piece here, I think, which builds on, Paul, your point about like grid interconnectivity, which is that the advantage of going big sooner is that you'll get ahead of this sort of wave of other folks who are going to be trying to get the same grid capacity, right? So, if you wait, somebody else may call dibs on that. I think we have time for one last question from the audience before we're over, and it was about grid and grid connectivity, and it was specifically who pays for that, right? If you need a new line to your depot, or if you need a new substation for your depot, is that your cost or is that the utility cost?
Go ahead, Paul.
So it breaks down in different ways. Ultimately, everybody pays for everything, some way or another, in ultimately the rate case later. So there's the site costs that is typically borne by the fleet themselves, unless they enroll in a utility program that provisions some money for their on-site. The grid side of it is typically negotiated between the customer and the utility based on their energy requirements over time and what does it take to actually bring it there. There are typically preliminary engineering studies and then final studies with utilities that are very important, because those will establish the cost basis, and then the tariff and the agreement that can get signed will establish who pays for which portion of those service line extensions, or in other cases, full-on distribution grid upgrades or even transmission. These get to be quite expensive. So you've got to figure out, early on who will take on those costs.
Okay, so it sounds like that's a good reason to talk to your utility early, both because, it depends on what kind of work is needed and what kind of utility you're working with.
Definitely, what programs they have, which was mentioned earlier, and then what are your specific costs, and are those going to be socialized across other customers, or are they dedicated to your provisioning of power that might be really your responsibility solely?
And that can get complicated with the utilities and their regulatory bodies as to what they actually can or can't do. And all utilities are going to have some form of line extension policy, and that will help subsidize some of the infrastructure changes that you need, but the rest of it is generally on the customer. And if there are programs in place to help subsidize some of that additional work to get power to a site that's socialized, usually those programs are limited in nature and have a cap in terms of participation or dollar amount that they're able to provide. And so if you and your neighbor are both looking to electrify your fleet and you get your application in before your neighbor does, you're going to benefit from whatever capacity is available on the feeder. You're going to benefit from any of those program costs, and then your neighbor might be trying to get energy once the feeder's been exhausted or there's a cap in place. And so all of those additional costs are now going to be borne by your neighbor.
Yes, okay. It's always complicated. Rob, thank you. Paul, thank you very much. Devin, Danny, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you all. I feel like I sort of understand this problem in a different way and also see sort of more opportunity. So I really appreciated the conversation. I'm just going to pass it back to Rachel to wrap us up.
Awesome. And I echo Ari's sentiments. Thank you so much for participating today. And thank you all who tuned in today. That wraps up our 9th bootcamp session. Remember to go back to the landing page of this session on runonless.com to take the quiz. It is now live and available. And be sure to connect with us on social media. If we could go to the final slide here, we have our social handles linked here. So thank you again. We will see you in the last session on September 5th, where John Richardson on our team and his panel of experts will discuss strategies for electric depot site planning and construction. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you guys very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.